Okay, we're recording. All right, 3, 2, 1. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest, a returning guest. We had talked last year, May 2018, about his book titled Behind the Wall of Illusion, The Religious, Occult, and Esoteric World of the Beatles. He is an author. His name is Sean MacLeod, and he is coming to us from Ireland. But tonight we're going to talk about a book he wrote on a very important figure in American music, really world music, Phil Spector. And the title of his book is Phil Spector, Sound of the 60s. So, Sean, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Awesome.
Hey, William.
Hi. Thanks for agreeing to the interview. Really interesting subject. I didn't know the totality of Spector's influence. I knew that he was important. I don't have a musical background, but after reading through your book, I was very surprised at how many people look to him as, I mean, even like you finished the book saying about Lennon, talking about how important he was, and we can get into that. But you also published a book, not only Behind the Wall of Illusion, but Leaders of the Pack, Girl Groups of the 60s and 1960s and their influence on popular culture in Britain and America. So you definitely have a few other titles out there. But maybe we can just talk a little bit about your background for people who didn't hear our last interview and how you became interested in the subject of Phil Spector.
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, William, thanks for asking me to do the interview again. It's really a pleasure to talk to you, and I really enjoyed the last interview.
Thanks.
And my background is I live in Limerick, which is west of Ireland, next up, I guess, after New York. If you're flying to Ireland, you'll probably hit Shannon Airport, which is just down the road from me here. So if you leave JFK or wherever, you'll arrive in Shannon Airport. I think it's the next stop over the Atlantic. So that's where I live now, and I teach in the college here, the senior college in Limerick, or College of Further Education. I teach music and media, film, and journalism. I'm also currently doing a PhD in the university, so I'm in my second year of that, and that's music related too. Yeah, so as I said, I live in Limerick, which is on the west of the country, but I grew up in Dublin, which is on the east, and it's a lot more, obviously it's a capital city, but a lot more influenced, I think, there's a lot more influence from Britain and kind of the kind of anglicized part of the country. So, my upbringing in Dublin was a lot more nearly British and American than it was Irish in a way.
Interesting.
So, yeah, if I had grown up in the countryside, I might not have been so familiar with popular music to the extent I am, having grown up in Dublin.
And your interest in music started from an early age, correct?
Yeah, since I was kind of just 7 or 8 years of age, and then around 11, I heard a Beatles song, and suddenly it was just okay. That was kind of what I was interested in then. Really, from the rest of my life was music and playing music and reading about it and studying it, and yeah. So of course, it led me into other things because of literature, and from literature into philosophy, but I think the root of it all was music, really. Yeah.
Gotcha. And so then you probably knew about Phil Spector and his influence on 60s groups and music.
No, not really. I think funnily enough, we don't. A lot of people wouldn't really know Phil Spector so well this side of the pond, I suppose. And it's I think in America he's still, just from looking into his life and into basically researching this book. Yeah, I did kind of feel still a huge interest in Spector in America, more so than I think there is probably in Britain and Ireland and possibly Europe. Because I'll mention Spector to people. When I was writing the book, for example, people would ask me who Phil Spector was, and they knew the songs okay, but they're not really too familiar with who he is. But so I did know Spector. Yeah, I knew who he was, and of course when I went and I did the girl groups book, like I knew of Spector through his connections with the Beatles, and I knew about the girl group stuff, and then I kind of learned a lot more in relation to him, and just his personality. I would have known stuff. Friends of mine would have been interested in him, and I would have heard stories about kind of crazy carry on. But yeah, it wasn't until I really did the girl groups books that I really got to know him a little bit better. And to be honest, William, when I finished the girl group book, because there's a chapter in Spector on the girl groups, because he obviously was a big area of his career working with the girl groups, the Ronettes and the Crystals and Darlene Love and people like that. That I wasn't, when Roman and Littlefield asked me to do this book on Spector, I kind of felt I had covered what I wanted to cover on him, but I kind of obliged to do it. I obliged them by doing it. I guess that's the right way of saying that. And I kind of thought, well, yeah, there's a little bit more I could kind of approach. There's an angle I can approach this from that hadn't been in the other books that I'd read on Spector for the girl group book, if that makes sense.
Gotcha.
And but the more I read, the more I went into him specifically, and not just his relationship to the girl groups. I was really surprised myself again, because you think, he's got this. I suppose his major period is from around 61 with the Crystals up to 63 or 4 with the Ronettes, and then he kind of disappears, and then he comes back with You've Got That Love and Feeling, and then the River Deep Mountain High with Tina Turner and that. And then, of course, it goes into the relationship with the Beatles and the Let It Be stuff, and then the Lennon albums and the George Harrison albums, etc. But prior to his work with the girl groups, he has a huge back catalogue of stuff that I wasn't really that familiar with. And some of it's not amazing. Some of it's quite interesting, particularly for the period. You're talking about 1959, 60, 61. And, you can find on YouTube, for example, the Phil Spector anthology before 1963. And it's a triple album.
Right, significant too. And he was he started out as a musician, but really kind of came into his own as a arranger producer. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, so he starts off as a jazz musician, and I think this is the kind of interesting thing maybe about Spector, is he starts off as this jazz musician as a young kid, and he seems to. I mean, you'll come across people who worked with him, for example, Lieber and Stoller and various other producers like that, who kind of play down his genius or his importance or whatever, and see him more as just a publicity man and somebody who could put a spin on things. And then, of course, there's others who think he was, the greatest, basically, American pop producer, composer, musician. Right. And so you have these very extreme camps. One, people who just don't rate him at all, and others who just think he's never been bettered. But
he has an impressive musical legacy that would discount saying that he was merely a kind of used car salesman of music. I mean, some of these songs are still played. I think in your book you mentioned that You've Lost That Love and Feeling is one of the most played songs on the radios to this day.
Yeah, sure. And but then you have people like George Harrison and Spector Spector produced three records by Harrison. All Things Must Pass, and the two after that, Dark Horse maybe. But anyway, Harrison dismisses the work that he did. He basically says, well, he didn't really do much at the end of the day, and he had to undo all that he had done because it was just too much.
Interesting.
And Lennon, of course, kind of says a similar thing. So it's kind of really hard to know. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of hard to know. I mean, you can kind of hear with Spector's girl group stuff that, you know, it really, for me, I mean, I love that music, and I think he does an amazing. I mean, they're amazing records.
Right. I mean, what is it? Be My Baby, Then He Kissed Me. Those are incredible tunes.
Yeah, and if you can think, I suppose, back to that time, you know, how the production, you know, the ability to produce the music was probably not so as easy as it is today.
Rudimentary,
you know?
Right? Yeah,
rudimentary, yeah. And so possibly from that point of view, he managed to get these really amazing sounds. But and he obviously the records obviously impressed people like Brian Wilson, even groups like the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. But it's just, you know, there's no one in the middle. It just seems to be a bit erratic. So how, you know, people just dismiss him. Now, personally, I think, and that's what I was kind of saying about him learning the music at a young age. He learned jazz, but when rock and roll came along, he kind of realized that this was what was the new set, the type of music to play, because this is what was the kind of zeitgeist.
Right.
And apparently as well, and this is from people who knew him as a kid more so, they would kind of say, everybody loved to hear Spector play the guitar, and all the girls would crowd around Spector when he played the guitar, because he was able to get, and this is a kind of quote unquote, a radio sound out of his guitar. So in other words, he seems to have been able to tune into the sound of something, and he seemed to have a knack for, or a talent for making something sound good. And of course, I guess that's really what he became known for, sound of the record.
Right.
Know?
I mean, they called it the Wall of Sound. Do you want to talk about that?
The Wall of Sound, and also what his logo for his record company was Tomorrow Sounds Today. So it's very much about sound in a sense for Spector. Yeah, the Wall of Sound. So the Wall of Sound was, I think, Spector just trying to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger sound, and it was an approach that he seemed to have developed where it wasn't necessarily about the particular instruments that were played. There's not so much a kind of a distinction between the particular timbres of the instruments. So, you know, you don't hear necessarily a piano and a guitar or a trumpet or something as distinct sounds in themselves, but they all kind of seem to just mesh together into this one big, you know, overwhelming sound. So that was his thing. And I think possibly it only could, maybe it only had such a life, you know, you could only do that for so long before it starts to start sounding the same.
Right.
And that possibly, I think that became the criticism, you know, when Spector started falling out of favour. That was the thing I think people criticised his music for. It started to sound the same, even though a lot of those songs are so good. Probably his formula didn't change, you know.
Right, he didn't update it. But he was very young. I mean, he also had a very strong business savvy that a lot of musicians don't have.
He seems to have had, see, I think Spector really, and when you do a search, or when I did a search anyway for Spector on the internet, unfortunately, what comes up a lot of the time is today is Spector as a kind of, you know, being imprisoned and murdering Lana Clarkson and etc. And well, maybe that's something you want to talk about later on. But
yeah, we can finish it up, sure.
Yeah, I think it's you know, it's a very unfair, really, I think, on Spector, and that's, you know, we need to get into that other subject later on. But and of course, whether he murdered or didn't murder or whatever, but obviously to murder somebody is you know, it's not something that you want to be kind of giving credit to somebody for. But despite that, I think, you know, from the terms of his work in music is something that he needs to be credited for. But in order to understand Spector, the music, his role as a businessman, even his situation that he managed to get himself into and this murder case and get thrown in prison, I think you really need to go back to, I guess, like most people, but specifically with Spector, is his childhood, because he really had just such a messed up childhood in a way. His father committed suicide when he was 10, I think, when Spector was 10. And, he's apparently quite a happy, settled, very quite well-adjusted child. And then when this happened, you can only imagine how devastating it would be for a young boy. Plus, it probably triggered off what was an underlying kind of, mental disorder that seemed to kind of somewhat be there in his mother's side of the family anyway, and it's kind of neurosis. Mm-hmm. His sister ended up, I think, in kind of with mental problems and that kind of thing. So I think this predisposition possibly towards that, his father killing himself. He didn't just die; he committed suicide, and obviously had a huge impact on him. And so, in a way, again, he was kind of left. He was left at a very young age, also with this responsibility, I think, of kind of having to fill in his father's shoes, be the kind of the man of the house kind of thing. So, I think it very, very, and then his mother moved from New York. And so he ends up in this alien environment in Los Angeles.
Right.
So he's also kind of taken out of his environment, the environment that he was kind of used to a certain extent. Right. Which
when he went to high school, he was kind of right in the middle of everything. Their famous recording studio, Sunset Boulevard, Hollywood's right there. I mean, it was Fairfax and Beverly, I think, where he went to high school. Yeah. So he was immersed in this environment. Musical, West Coast musical environment. Yeah,
well, again, it was just kind of beginning as well when he was a teenager. So, and in a way, there's, I suppose, a certain amount of that kind of, he was kind of in the right place at the right time in that sense, because the teenager was just beginning to have a voice. Kind of at Elvis, just 1956, so Spector would have been about 16. He's already kind of, he's learned his trade as a musician. He's been playing the guitar for 4 or 5 years. He's obviously got a talent for it. He's got an ear for how something should sound. And so when he goes into the studio for the first time and he just manages to write a song, the kind of song that the Teddy Bears did, To Know Him Is to Love Him, which seems to have been something that came to him one night when he was asleep, and it was about his father and things like that. So that's kind of interesting in itself. But that kind of sparks off his career. He has a big hit with that, mainly because the record companies around that area, as you mentioned, there was a few small record companies who were trying to kind of get into the rock and roll scene and into the teenage scene. And Spector came along with his group, which was, a couple of teenagers and a teenage girl, and they had this song. And the song, just the record company that signed them kind of knew a few people, like Dick Clark and stuff like that, and so it got played, on the American Bandstand, and that's just kind of catapulted it into kind of national success, really. So he was kind of in the right place at the right time, I think. He didn't have any success then with that band after that. He couldn't write another song for a long time, and he seemed to have to kind of collaborate with other people. And so in that sense, I think Spector is less so kind of a musician in his own right, but he seems to have been somebody who needed to collaborate with, and somebody who I think people found him to be a good collaborator, and they would, there was a kind of a chemistry there for certain groups of people with
Right,
Spector.
and you had written something interesting in the book. You had a quote from Spector, like he didn't necessarily think he was collaborating with the musicians. And I quote, Spector said, "When you see a Stanley Kubrick movie, you tell me how many times you immediately remember the cast. 1, 2. It's the same with Fellini. And that's what I wanted to do when I directed a recording. Singers are instruments. They are tools to be worked with." So you kind of had this, he was the orchestral guider or whatever, through his career, his multi-decade career. It seemed like he wanted to be the person behind the scene, pulling the strings.
Yeah, well, that was, I think, in Spector's head. That's he kind of thought he was, he was doing everything. He was, the Fellini, the Kubrick, the Mozart, the Beethoven. These are all names.
Wagner, he was influenced by Wagner too.
Yeah, so he puts himself into very grand company there, so I think he liked to think of himself in this sense, but but I mean the Ronettes are not the Ronettes without Ronnie Spector's voice, or the Crystals are not the Crystals without the Crystals' voices, or Darlene Love, or he couldn't have produced the Lennon records without Lennon's songwriting. And then also a lot of the songs that he uses are not his songs. He might have helped on writing them, and he might have helped shape them, which seems to have been the case a lot of the time. But say Barry and Greenwich, or Violent Man, or Goffin and King, he needed these people as well. Probably maybe in some ways as much as they kind of needed him to be able to see the potential in their songs and know how to make them into really good records.
Right. Just incidentally, you mentioned Lennon. It was Spector who produced one of Lennon's probably his most famous song, Imagine. So whenever you hear that on the radio, it was produced in '71 with Spector. Yeah.
So again, it's hard to know how much Spector was involved in that, but I think the strings, and he kind of made it. He kind of gave it a more commercial feel. I think that's, as Lennon said, it was plastic Gona bound with chocolate on top. Maybe he was quite good like that. He could hear the sound. He could hear the sound of what would sell, and in that sense, back to that question, not what you said earlier about him being a businessman. I think that's what I was kind of trying to say earlier about trying to understand his childhood, because all these insecurities, he seemed to have all these insecurities. So I think as a businessman, I think he had to really try to prove to himself, and also to other people, that he was competent and he was capable and he was in charge and he was in control, and he could do these things. So
and you had written in your book that the mom saw him after the dad died as the kind of breadwinner, like she was preparing him to be more business savvy. I think that came through. And also, he wasn't super athletic, and he was maybe a smaller person. So this was kind of where he expressed himself, was being the big time producer.
Yeah, so I think he seemed to, instead of being maybe a great businessman with great business acumen, I think he just had this incredible, probably, need to succeed and to be in control, and just to kind of not, maybe he just kind of much a bigger ego than he did have business acumen, and he was able, he just needed to prove himself, maybe that's I don't know a huge amount about business in a sense, but I mean maybe that's just what you need to do that. But he definitely had the confidence, or the drive to be in control. I think he just had that drive to want to be in control of everything, and that meant his record company, his songs, his what he released, what he didn't release, who he gave the stuff to, whether he had to kind of pay for publicity and stuff, which is something he didn't like to do for his songs. It all had to be in his terms. He had to be in control. So at the end of the day, though, as well, William, because of that need for control, he kind of alienated himself from the business. I mean, I would think, in a sense, that someone like Paul McCartney or something is probably learned to be a lot more astute businessman in a sense, because he was a lot more diplomatic, and
Right.
he controls his own music now pretty much, and did for a long time. He has control over his royalties, things like this. So I think Spector alienated himself in a way, in a sense.
He was too much of a control freak and also a perfectionist. Like, apparently he would just walk on other people's toes. He wanted to get done his way.
Yeah. So whether that was for perfection or whether it was just to kind of, again, more, I need this control. But I think there's a psychological issue there, really, which stems back to the death of his father and the situation with his mother, that underlying predisposition for neurosis that he had, that seemed to be there in his family, the pressure put on him by his family to kind of, attend to kind of be the father figure of the. So, and then of course you've got all these other things, as you mentioned. He was small of stature. He wasn't particularly athletic, but he also, as well, from the business point of view, again, he didn't seem to have a problem with lying. He didn't seem to have a problem with, kind of using people and kind of exploitation. So whether that's good business acumen or whether it's just, other people may not have done that, but Spector would have done it, and it gave him the edge in some ways.
Right, but he I mean, financially, he was very successful at an early age, correct?
Yeah, well, his first hit with what was it called? Sorry,
was it the Ronettes? Was it a Ronette song?
No, with the teddy bears. I just mentioned there a minute ago.
To know him is to love him.
Yeah, to know him is to love him. That made him a lot of money, I think, but maybe not so much. I think the money kind of ran out after a while, but it really gave him this huge confidence. By the time he got to make the Ronettes, the Crystals and the Ronettes music, he was making he was making money, but he was spending a lot of money too, because he was these records were costing a lot of money, and a lot of times he wouldn't release the records, so he was blowing the money too, But again, as I said, he had such a backlog. By the time he had done the Ronettes, or the Crystals and the Ronettes, he had a huge back catalogue of stuff anyway. So I'm sure, I imagine there was, I don't know what the royalties were like on that, but probably some of them were quite good. And then again, I think, later on, again, how he maybe control over these records, and how they were released as anthologies and things like that. He became quite astute in that regard, I think.
Yeah, he had, I think, 4 number 1 songs. To Know Him, to Love Him, Harrison's My Sweet Lord, Crystals, He's a Rebel, and Righteous Brothers, You've Lost That Love and Feeling. So if they're making it to number 1 on the sales charts, that's significant. Especially back then.
He had lots of top 10 hits as well, so they would have generated quite a bit of of a royalty for him.
Yeah, you list a lot of his successful songs at the very end of the book.
Yeah. So I think what's also interesting is, which I didn't really go into in the book, and I didn't really know how to go into it in a way, but this kind of connection with Wagner, and because he was always. He was obsessed with Wagner, and but what people used to call Spector the kind of magician, and that he could turn, a record into gold, the alchemist they would call him, and funnily it was the same with Wagner. Wagner was considered kind of like, this great magician, more so than a musician, and very charismatic, mesmerizing, kind of controlling in a sense. And it's interesting that Spector had very similar qualities and traits in a way. Um,
Yeah, it is. I mean, but he thought Spector liked to think of himself as one of the great composers, though, right?
yeah, you like to think of himself as kind of some kind of modern day Wagner, I suppose.
Right.
But the fact that he had these, I mean, people would say, despite that he was short and, you know, seemed to have, physical stature, he was, some people saw him as one of the most charismatic people they had ever met, and these would be people who would have met
Yeah, you just popped out there. Charismatic figure.
quite that kind of, you know, yeah, supernatural, I think,
Right.
in a sense, charm that maybe people like Wagner and that were supposed to have had. And again, I mean, it's interesting if you ever going to see footage of the Imagine film where Lennon's working with Spector, just Spector, Lennon just kind of put, Spector's at the center of everything for Lennon. Lennon just, which you would be surprised at, but
Right. And you finish off the book with a quote saying Lennon quoting, saying, "Spector is the genius other geniuses go to."
yeah, I think Lennon's son, Sean Lennon, said that about Spector.
Okay, gotcha. Sorry.
That Spector was the genius that the other geniuses go to. But again, this is all, that's John Lennon's son saying that. So I presume he's going to think of his father as a genius, and then makes it very nice to think that Spector is the genius. It's all a little bit kind of insular, that kind of world. But I think mostly just like the Beatles, as individuals, were they geniuses? Well, I don't know. I think they were very talented, but in the 60s and as that group, did something work through them that was tremendously powerful, a kind of a zeitgeist,
right.
And I think, it did.
Yeah, I agree.
Probably not so much of their own conscious creation, but they became conduits really, and I think they started to become a little bit more conscious of what was working through them and tried to kind of harness it a bit more consciously by the end of their career. And I think Spector and I think that's there's a chapter in there between Elvis and the Beatles. I think Spector, in a sense, was a kind of a zeitgeist figure as well. He seemed to just channel something between that period of Elvis and the Beatles that was, you gave pop music a kind of, gave it the life in a sense. It gave it a direction until the Beatles and the British invasion came. It kept it alive in a way.
I think Lennon said of Spector, he kept rock and roll alive while Elvis was in the army. So it went Elvis, Spector, Beatles. But I think there were similar things. I'm glad you brought up the Beatles because there's a very strong similar theme between both books in the whole the ability of these musicians to kind of capture the zeitgeist in the teenage groups, on both sides of the Atlantic.
Yeah, so I do kind of think, the more I kind of look into this period, that after World War II, you get this total shift in consciousness, really, and it very much is taken up by the younger generation, and it's suddenly you've got the teenager, and suddenly you've kind of greater sense of freedom, and suddenly you've got a greater sense of, the individual in a sense, the notion that people can go and do and whatever they wish to do in a sense, because the technology is there to do that, the communication systems are there to do that, the awareness of I can do this is there, and I think clearly Elvis, the Beatles, all these became, kind of very self-aware young people. They were very self-aware young people, aware that they could, write songs and that they could break out of the the constraints of their socio-economic conditions or whatever. And they started to become aware that the world was, they could explore the world and they could get things in the world that I think prior to the war would have been kind of out of the reach of a lot of particularly young people and particularly people from the social economic backgrounds that they would have been from. They would have probably, definitely in Britain, gone down the mine and just worked in the mine or worked on the boats or this kind of thing. And I think the Beatles, Elvis, and to some extent Spector in the background there, made it people aware that they could do these things as well. And suddenly you just had, you didn't have rock and roll groups in Liverpool or in much of England, definitely pretty much not in Ireland. I don't think so much in the States either, where people were forming rock and roll bands and expressing themselves, writing songs, going off and playing gigs and traveling up and down the country or going abroad or, making a living out of doing that. But after the war, after the 60s, pretty much everybody was, had a guitar and was forming a band, and some of them did it for fun and some of them did it, they got so far with it and then they had to kind of give up, or others continued to do it and became very successful, and others, do it on a not such a successful level, but they still seem to make a livelihood out of it. But they write their own material. Do you know what I mean? They're expressing their own ideas and feelings, etc. So they're becoming more aware of who they are, and this, I think, would have been kind of impossible for younger people to have done prior to that period.
Right. Well, right after. There are definitely parallels between Spector's story and Beatles, because post-war they didn't have the post-war or pre-war or war burdens or those types of things. So they were all surfing this kind of zeitgeist that talked about independence. Spector himself was actually kind of forward-thinking. His bands were all African-American women talking about women's perspectives, which and then He Kissed Me and all these things. And you point that out in the book. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, so I think, again, Spector, as you said, he had his pulse on what was happening at the time and related to the teenager, to young people, and also to kind of African Americans. And whether it was all promotional stuff or not, it's hard. Some people will say, well, he's just selling that was his story. But I do think he was, to some extent, and whether he was or he wasn't, the fact that he made those records with these young people singing about young people's, concerns, whether they were just, about having fun, or whether it was, and a lot of Spector's those songs are, Be My Baby is about, sexual impulses and urges. It's not just a love song. There's something deeper there. Uptown, I know he didn't write the lyrics for these songs, but, it's very much got a social theme in it. And so do many of the other songs. But so the fact that he was, there was these girls, African-American girls, who were in the charts quite a lot, obviously performing on television a lot, performing in clubs a lot. So they were there in the public eye and singing about things of kind of, that were beginning to concern teenagers. A bit maybe like Rebel Without a Cause tries to deal with those particular concerns of the teenagers, alienation and, being accepted and parents and constraints and those kind of things. So I think, he is. So by the time his period is finished in 64, 65, and the Beatles and the Stones come, they talk a little bit about, they sing a little bit about that for the first, 64, 65. But once you hit 1966, you're kind of into, much deeper issues. Songs about revolution, songs about I can't get no satisfaction. So, they're much more intense.
Yes, yeah, that's a good point.
and it's only a couple of years. So it's a little bit like, when you're 13 or 14 and you discover the opposite sex, so you kind of have a certain amount of freedom. You can kind of go out and stay out a bit later. By the time you get to 16 or 17, things become a little bit more. You're moving closer towards finishing school, having to kind of enter into adulthood, and so your mindset is, it gets you go a little bit deeper, and things become there's more concern about things. In a sense, you might become more politically aware, or you know what I mean. So I think it kind of, that period reflects that teenage period. I think it really reflects it in its overall, the 50s, 60s, possibly into the 70s, reflects that period of your teenage years, in a kind of what do they call it, a microcosmic sense.
Yeah, people are still referencing those too, though. The Ronettes are still played all the time, Beatles, a lot of these, Spector influenced the Beach Boys sound and themes, right? The themes of the Beach Boys. I thought you wrote, I recollect you wrote in the book that Spector's approach and style influenced the Beach Boys and Brian Wilson. Yeah, so all those kind of themes.
Yeah, and then of course the next generation of because again, when you think about, then you go into the 70s, so the 60s kind of finishes up, and there seemed to be a sense that the great utopian vision that was there for the 60s, the peace, love kind of movement, kind of, decayed very rapidly by the end of, by 69, really.
Right. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I think in the book you talk about one of Spector's competitors / antagonist, Melcher, was the target of the Manson family in 69. And so that was interesting. And there was some kind of connection between Manson and Melcher too. Yeah,
that's a strange connection, all right. Yeah, I looked into that, but I never, it would be very interesting to look deeper into that relationship between.
Well,
I did it.
It was because of Manson was friends with, I think, one of the Wilson brothers, and that brother was friends with Melcher, and Melcher was the guy who gave Manson, a chance to make a record, and some of that stuff was recorded, and so Manson was around there, definitely. So.
Yeah, but it's deeper than that, William, because Manson, he knew Dennis Wilson.
Dennis Wilson, yeah, thanks.
That's right, yeah, and then there was the Melcher connection. But Terry Melcher was living in the house. If I can get this right now, he was living in the house where the murders. How was that? So it was Doris Day's house.
Right. That was his mom. That was Melcher's mom.
That's Melcher's mom, and Melcher was told to leave the house. Apparently, it's been a while since I looked into this now, but so just this connection between Melcher and the house in which Sharon Tate and those were murdered. Okay, so, and then there's the whole Laurel Canyon crowd, and then there's the whole this whole connection between what are called the Young Turks, and you've got people like Jack Nicholson.
Yep.
You've got
Mamas and Papas.
Mamas and Papas. You've got Melchard's in the middle of that. You've got, I think, David Crosby from the Byrds.
Right.
Do
you know that Mamas and Papas, it was Phillips and then Mama Cass, I forgot her name, but they were both listed on according to Dave McGowan, they were listed on as character witnesses for the trials. They were never called to the jury. To the stand, but they were listed as people who knew Manson. So that he's wrapped up. That was deep Laurel Canyon stuff.
Yeah, well, also I think Terry Melcher, even Paul McCartney though, was Terry Melcher, I think, with John Phillips. Is that right?
Yes,
and Manson, where they were at the Monterey Pop Festival and they were going around handing out LSDs. So seemingly this is from what I've read. and so this whole conspiracy about the LSD thing, to try and undermine this kind of counterculture that was happening. This I'm not sure how familiar you are with the CIA and the war, drugs and war against the masses.
Absolutely.
Acid Dreams and these books. So
Brotherhood of Love or whatever it was the CIA front distributing massive amounts of hits of LSD.
Yeah, and was Sharon Tate not also connected to Anton LaVey's Church of Satan, and she was part of this witch group?
Yes. I think Eye of the Beholder was the film she was in, where she was wearing all kinds of, it was basically an occult themed film. And don't get me started with Roman Polanski. These guys are all deep. Spector is probably just right around all of this stuff.
Well, it's kind of hard to know. I mean, because I think Spector, he seems to have been isolated in a way, maybe because he did it himself. He goes into seclusion for a long time.
He peaked early. He peaked by the time, I think it was 26, as mentioned, like he had already made money and already alienated a significant amount of people.
Yeah, well, that's interesting again, because in the Beatles book, I talk about this 27 thing. So Spector's coming into his 27th year. And it seems to be a time where if you don't kind of rejuvenate or move on, you just kind of, basically that's it. Your creative powers, your creative juices just burn out. So it's a bit of a challenging time, I think, for everybody, that 27 period, which is why possibly as well the connection with rock stars who kind of burn out physically, right. Actually physically burn out, and they die at 27. But I think creatively, and it's interesting because with the Beatles, I think in Lennon at 27, he kind of loses his ego. He'd taken so much LSD. So after Peppers, he kind of is gone, and kind of McCartney becomes the main driving force of the group.
Gotcha.
So there's a kind of a 27 period there for Lennon in a way, and it takes him a long time to kind of really get himself back. Even though he's making records, I think by 75 he's just given up, and I think he seems to have had an experience, Lennon, by just around 1980. He was in on a boat. He had a boat, and there was a huge storm, and he had to take kind of control of it in the boat, or else they were all kind of, that was the end of them all. So I think after that experience, it gave him the kind of confidence, in a sense, to take control of his life again. And then, of course, he went back into the recording studio to make that one last album.
Right, he was shot in 1982, right? Wasn't that right?
1980. So right. He just kind of gets his life back together in a way. His, particularly his creative life.
Right.
And he's gotten rid of.
But let's get back to Spector. So Spector kind of peters out at 27, but he still is involved. He remasters Let It Be of the Beatles. He's producing Harrison stuff. He's still kind of working out with making music with some other bigwigs, and then this whole event happens later on in his life where somebody dies at his house, right?
Yeah, well, his son then died as well. I think he had a son, and his son died of leukemia a couple of years in the 70s. I can't remember the date now, but
he had married one of the Ronettes, right?
He married Veronica Bennett, the lead singer.
Right, 2 kids, one.
He kind of took. So it's interesting that even though he's kind of got this, like, all these girl groups, and they're kind of out singing these songs, and they're kind of progressive in a sense for kind of the feminist movement in a way. He then marries Veronica Bennett and basically just keeps her incarcerated in his house. And I think she had to kind of actually physically escape after just years of being locked away. She had to escape, from her own house.
Wow.
There's these contradictions there with Spector, and the more I kind of think about it, or just even talking about it here, the more I kind of just feel a lot of Spector, a lot of it is really this kind of, whether it's making music or whether it's, having these black girls and, being in some way kind of a face for the civil rights movement, or they're female, so there's kind of the feminist movement, with kind of, helping to kind of push that forward, the teenage thing, making records, being the businessman, the entrepreneurial, music tycoon, the tycoon of teen, as Tom Wolfe called him. I think underneath it all, it's just this huge struggle with his own self, the need constantly to prove himself to himself and to show that he was actually somebody, which kind of suggests in a way that he never really felt he kind of was anybody. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, he was compensating for something. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and he had this strange kind of control issues with women that started before the death of this. What is he? Was she a waitress or something like that? What was her name?
Lana Clarkson.
Lana Clarkson. Yeah.
Yeah, well, she was a kind of an B movie actress, and she was working in this club that Spector went to, and he kind of just seemingly brought her back to his villa or his mansion, and no one really kind of knows what happened, William. I mean, they were the only two people in the house, right, as far as I know. Spector came running out of the house and told seemingly his chauffeur that he had just killed somebody, or he thought that he'd killed somebody, and but it just that no one really seems to know. No one seems to know, and I get the impression, obviously, Lana Clarkson possibly knew, but she's dead, so she can't really tell anybody. And I really kind of feel, and I've kind of didn't really go into it much in the book because I didn't really. It seems to have kind of overshadowed everything else that Spector has done, right. And despite all Spector's contradictions and the kind of his neurosis and his just mania, I do think he's created some incredibly great pop music, or been part of it, in whatever capacity that is, whether it's because of his great wall of sound or his great vision as a producer, or whether it was just kind of accidental that he managed to, for a couple of years, create something that really just worked for the time. Whatever, I think he was there. He did make these, he was in some way instrumental in making them happen. And I think, as Lennon said, he kept pop music alive while Elvis was in the army. And so for those few years, I think he's kind of very important, very interesting. It's not necessarily, and it's great music, pop music. Absolutely. And I think it really does reflect, as a lot of pop music does, this changing consciousness of the teenager, which is pretty much, very important for us today in many ways, whether in a negative sense or a positive sense. But the thing with the Clarkson thing is, I think, William, is that it's unfortunate that that's kind of overshadowed everything, particularly since no one actually knows. I know he was convicted and he was sent to jail, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he consciously, pulled a gun out and shot somebody.
Right, but what was his version of the story?
He doesn't seem to know what's happened. He says he didn't kill her, what's interesting about that, he basically reckons that people were out to get him. He was kind of, for a long time, he upset people in the business. Other people wanted to make an example of him because he's so famous, because celebrity culture in LA and people get away with things. So for many reasons, Spector, he denies killing Lana Clarkson. He basically claims that people were out to get him, etc., etc. Now, some of the evidence seems to suggest there was a film made about this with Al Pacino and Helen Mirren, where Pacino plays Spector, and this movie basically makes out that there was no way Spector could have killed her because he was a very short guy and she was very tall. So the angle at which the gun was supposed to be pointing, etc., just wasn't possible for somebody of his, his size and etc. Apparently, there was no blood found on his clothes. So whether or not that's true, or whether there's explanations for that, the point there is that this film particularly, I think, went out of its way to kind of to investigate what happened, and then to kind of show that this necessarily wasn't what
could have what's supposed to. So who else did it? If he didn't do it, how did she get shot?
Yeah, well, again, as I said, we don't really know unless we were there. What I do think, I think at most, or definitely, we can say Spector is to blame for the situation because, this habit he had of carrying guns around with him, this inferiority complex that he seemed to have had. The fact that he seemed to feel the need to control, women, and it gave him some kind of sexual prowess that he could get a woman back to his flat and, get her to do whatever he wanted, kind of thing, whatever that was, So all of these things really are the downfall. These are his, real problems, his weaknesses, and these are kind of the cause to his own downfall in a sense. So the fact that he ended up in prison on this murder charge is really his own fault, I think. Right. But it's still a different. The fact that whether he did kill her or not, I mean, it just. There's no one now. There's no witnesses.
No witnesses, right? Just his denial, right? But they still brought charges against him, and they stuck. I guess the jury said convict. He's not getting out of jail while he's alive. That's for sure.
Well, he did. He was. As far as I can remember now, he had two trials. The first trial he was acquitted, and then there was a second trial. And I'm sorry, William, I don't remember all the details because it's been a while since I've been involved in this particular area, with and that. But so anyway, any of your listeners can kind of, if they're interested, they can check that out. Yeah, there was a second. This was the second trial, so I think he was acquitted the first time, but
it's unfortunate too because he did have a pretty legendary career, and now this is the negative bookend on that life that, this death arose out of his own personal shortcomings that had been with him for decades. So yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah, and I think in that sense, I mean, in a way, okay, the lady who died, Lana Clarkson, again, that's very tragic. You can't really just kind of ignore that and just focus on, Spector did something really stupid and he really spoiled his career because at the end of the day, this woman got killed. And we have to kind of keep that in mind at the same time. But yeah, it's really, I think Spector, it makes him kind of interesting in a way, even though I don't personally find him particularly interesting myself, Yeah. I mean, I've read a lot of books on Spector and that, but he's not really a person that I would really, if he's been interviewed on the TV or whatever, I don't know if it would really interest me that much.
Gotcha. Well, we're now at the 55-minute mark. I mean, we've kind of covered the importance of Spector's influence on music in the 60s, the tragic end. Is there anything else that you think we might have missed? Or anything else you want to mention?
I don't think so, but I just wanted to finish saying I think what does make him interesting in a way is just this huge contradictions that are there with him. The fact that he was so successful, he sold his great music in a way, and also, he was quite innovative in how he ran his business, his record business, how he made the records,
Right.
coming from nowhere and kind of, making this huge impression on the popular music industry. And at the same time, all those talents he had, or abilities he had to do that, I think come from this kind of underlying feeling of insecurity and the need to prove himself, which stems back to the death of his father. And of course, this then is what, at the same time, causes his kind of this destruction, because he ends up getting him into all these stupid, really, need to control every situation, and whether that means with music or with some kind of, a gun or something like that.
Right.
It's what ends him up in prison.
Right. Well, that's a great way to end it. So the book is Phil Spector, Sound of the 60s. It's available on Amazon. Also, your prior book that we discussed was Behind the Wall of Illusion, the religious, occult, and esoteric world of the Beatles. And then another book, Leaders of the Pack Girl Groups in the 1960s and their influence on popular culture in Britain and America. So thank you very much, Sean MacLeod. I appreciate you taking the time to talk about Phil Spector.
Thanks, William. Thanks very much.
All right, cool. All right, we're done. That's good. I gotta...